It's hard to believe, but the Donkey Kong Country series celebrated its anniversary this year. In 1994, the jump-and-run game from Rare and Nintendo was released on the Super Nintendo and blew everyone away with its sensational graphics and seamless gameplay, including my 8-year-old self. Donkey Kong Country was revolutionary. It extended the lifespan of the Super Nintendo by more than 2 years almost single-handedly, and simultaneously marked the beginning of a success story between Nintendo and Rare that would last for 8 remarkable years. By 2019, Nintendo had released 16 spin-offs of the Donkey Kong Country series, including several ports, spin-offs, and remakes. I would like to take this milestone birthday as an opportunity to take a look at all the entries in this brilliant jump-and-run series. Let's celebrate the Monkey Gang properly and show Nintendo that the games are still popular and a new installment is eagerly desired. So grab a snack and join me in experiencing 30 years of Donkey Kong Country. Enjoy! As is often the case, our journey into the past does not begin in the release year of the first installment, which is 1994 in this case, but rather 3 years earlier, as I would like to provide some context. It is not wrong to take a look at the position Rare was in at the time and how they came to acquire the Donkey Kong brand. Finally, Nintendo became a partner only after the great success of Donkey Kong Country, making Rare a second-party studio of the Japanese video game giant. As so often, the origin story of Donkey Kong Country is a series of happy coincidences. When Rare decided in 1991 to develop fewer games in the future and focus on quality, the decision of the English company coincided with the release of the Super Famicom in Japan. In 1992, the founders of Rare, Chris Stamper and Tim Stamper, purchased the first SGI workstation along with the Alias D rendering software, which allowed them to create high-quality 3D rendered graphics, something that was only known at the time from major Hollywood productions. The SGI computer cost Rare a hefty sum and was naturally associated with a financial risk. If Rare failed to develop high-quality games based on the SGI workstation, the money would be wasted and Rare's future would be uncertain. Although the idea was to use the workstation for Ultra 64 developments, some Rare developers began working on a boxing game called Brute Force for the Super Nintendo, simply to familiarize themselves with the hardware and the software it contained. Unfortunately, I did not find any images of Brute Force, but I discovered that in 1992, Howard Lincoln, who was then the president of Nintendo of America, stumbled upon the game while on a business trip in England. Impressed by the technology, he suggested that Rare should demonstrate Brute Force to Nintendo of Japan. Perhaps something could be done with it. So, Tim Stamper traveled to Japan in early '93, carrying the SGI box game. At that time, however, the officials at Nintendo in Japan had very different concerns. They needed a competing product to Sega's Aladdin, which thrilled the masses in 1993 with its great graphics and smooth animations. When Tim Stamper flew in from distant Europe, Brute Force encountered little interest, but the technology behind it excited Nintendo's decision-makers. In their opinion, this could potentially create a game that could put Sega's Aladdin in its place. So Nintendo commissioned Tim Stamper to create a game based on their then-frozen Donkey Kong brand. Finally, the last Donkey Kong game had already been released in 1983 in arcades and did not achieve the desired success. Even the port on the Famicom and NES, released in 1984 and 1986 respectively in the West, fell short of expectations, prompting Nintendo to put the Donkey Kong brand on hold. So what did they have to lose? In the best case, Rare would develop an Aladdin killer for them, and in the worst case, they would release a few graphically appealing SNES Donkey Kong games and move on. The risk was low, so Tim Stamper had the opportunity to develop a game for Nintendo, which he of course did not want to miss. Nintendo gave the project the codename Country, simply because Rare was located in a rural part of England at the time. At home in England, Rare decided to create a jump-and-run game from the new Donkey Kong game and simply kept the codename during development, which led to the final name. 12 creative minds came together for the project, with the Stamper brothers sharing the director role, and Kevin Bayliss, whom I had the pleasure of personally welcoming to this channel, was tasked with redesigning Donkey Kong and adding new characters. Over time, the Kong Clan was formed. Since the Donkey Kong games in the arcades and on the NES had no lore and were alongside Mario, etc., since Pauline and no other characters were offered, Rare was free in their creative direction. Kevin Bayliss created, among other characters, the small sidekick Diddy Kong, who would become a permanent member of the Nintendo roster and even receive his own racing game in 1997. The 12-member team at Rare worked for 18 months on Donkey Kong Country and primarily used a method that would become known as advanced computer modeling. The team created high-quality renders of all main and secondary characters and environments before they were heavily compressed using AMC technology to fit onto the small SNES cartridge. Bayless and his artist colleagues began modeling the characters using Power Animator and adding textures. They then created the animations and rendered them frame by frame before compressing them for the game. The AMC process was handled by a specific computer that had a proprietary utility. Adapting to the state-of-the-art SGI workstations was difficult, as Steve Mayles once mentioned in an interview. The game was the first by Rare that required multiple programmers, but the pre-rendered graphics allowed for an unusual graphical variety and fidelity at the time. Tim Stamper constantly pushed the team to go even further and incorporate weather and lighting effects, which pushed the Super Nintendo hardware to its limits. Rendering and compressing the models took hours, so the team let the computers run overnight. The SGI machines required a massive air conditioning system to prevent overheating, while the team had to work in the summer heat without any relief. But the efforts bore fruit, and the game began to take shape. In early 1993, Tim Stamper traveled to Japan with an initial demo. The management at Nintendo was enthusiastic, but only Gunpei Yokoi expressed skepticism. The inventor of the Game Boy found the new Donkey Kong game to be 2D, whatever that was supposed to mean. However, since Shigeru Miyamoto was very impressed with the demo, Rare ultimately received the green light and complete creative freedom on top of that. Nevertheless, Miyamoto would occasionally reach out to Rare to contribute ideas and suggestions for improvements. He advised Kevin Bayless to move away from the initially rather blocky redesign, which resembled the Battletoads, and to use a slightly rounder design, including a red tie that Donkey Kong has worn as a trademark to this day. In terms of gameplay, the team at Rare took inspiration from the NES classic Super Mario Bros. 3. They wanted to create a game that appealed to both beginners and excited hardcore gamers. This resulted in 40 diverse levels, all of which were located on Kong Island, inhabited by Donkey Kong. In addition to Donkey and Diddy, there was also the old Cranky, whom Rare portrayed as the then-current Donkey Kong from the arcade halls, as well as Candy and Funky Kong. At Candy Kong, players were allowed to save their progress, while Funky's shuttle service enabled players to fly to previously visited levels on the island. The adversaries were also completely reimagined by Rare. The villainous King K. Rool commanded a horde of Kremlings and other animals that were after Donkey Kong's bananas. To defend against the Kremlings, Donkey and Diddy were joined by several animal companions such as Rambi the rhinoceros, Enguad the swordfish, Winky the frog, and Espresso the ostrich, which of course also brought playful variety to the game. Players had plenty to do overall. Aside from the animals and traditional jump and run sections, the developers implemented underwater levels, minecart races, and a plethora of barrels, which were seen as a tribute to the good old arcade days. With Diddy Kong, Rare introduced a sidekick for Donkey that not only played differently but also allowed players to take one more hit in single-player mode. However, if you had a buddy at home, Donkey Kong Country could even be played by two players, either cooperatively or alternately, as known from the Mario games. When playing together, Player 1 controlled Donkey, while Player 2 took control of Diddy, but only in turns. Simultaneous play was not possible at that time. Both monkeys had their own characteristics. Donkey was stronger and could defeat powerful opponents, while Diddy, although weaker, was quicker on his feet. Visually, there was also a lot of variety. Not only was the pure graphics top-notch, but the different levels were also presented in unique ways. Starting in the dense jungle, the journey took us through ancient temples and snowy mountains to dark swamps and dangerous industrial sites. The graphical feast for the eyes and the gameplay splendor were complemented by a beautiful soundtrack created by 3 composers at Rare, with a rather varied distribution of work among them. Robin Beanland contributed only 1 track, while Evelyn Novakovic added 7 songs, and David Wise composed the majority of the soundtrack with 18 tracks. What emerged was one of the best soundtracks of its time, and to this day I find some of the tracks absolutely outstanding. Overall, the music in all Donkey Kong games is fantastic, but tracks like Aquatic Ambience, Fear Factory, DK, Island Swing, and the Overworld music are among the best I have ever heard in my life. Even now, at this moment, as I sit here writing these lines, I am listening to the soundtrack of the game. Considering the 18 months the team had to develop Donkey Kong Country, the final result was outstanding, and Nintendo was aware of it. When Donkey Kong Country was unveiled at the Summer CES in June 1995, fans and press were astonished when Nintendo announced at the end of the trailer that the game would be released on the Super Nintendo. Most people thought that the material shown was developed for Nintendo's Ultra 64 console, as the graphics were so impressive for that time. Other bit games were miles behind Donkey Kong Country, which led many video game enthusiasts to purchase one of the already available 2 or 30 games on the Panasonic Do, Atari Agua, or Sega's Mega CD. There wasn't a single game that looked as good. After the CES, Nintendo produced a making of and sent it out in the form of a VHS cassette to loyal subscribers of the Nintendo Power magazine in the USA. Here in the country, the video cassette was also available for takeout and provided a behind-the-scenes look at the game. The more you saw of it, the more hyped you became. I have to know, I was right in the middle of the hype at the age of 8. I rarely wanted a game as much as Donkey Kong Country. When it was released worldwide in November 1994, Sega's Aladdin was no longer a topic of discussion. Donkey Kong Country had to compete with Sonic and Knuckles, which was released around the same time for the Sega Mega Drive, but it stood no chance against Nintendo's Ape Gang. Rare's flagship game quickly became a mega hit. The marketing worked, and in just 1 week, cartridges flew off the shelves in the USA, making Donkey Kong Country the almost best-selling video game of all time. 2 weeks after release, Nintendo of America recorded 1 million units sold and 6 million by the end of the year, which meant a sensational Christmas season for Nintendo and brought in over $400 million. Donkey Kong Country was suddenly everywhere. By the end of the SNES era, the platformer would sell over 9.3 million copies, making it the third best-selling SNES game to this day, and the best-selling Donkey Kong game. No other part of the franchise has ever come close to these sales figures, but you can't blame the game for that. Donkey Kong Country combined flawless gameplay with incredible graphics and a fantastic soundtrack at the end of 1994. It was accessible enough for beginners to enjoy, and it became increasingly challenging with each world, ensuring that hardcore gamers wouldn't get bored, especially if they wanted to discover all the secrets. It achieved the perfect balance of gameplay, visuals, and sound, something that only a few video games have managed to accomplish to this day. In 2001, when I first inserted the game into my SNES sometime in 1995, I was enchanted. I can't describe it any other way. It still exerts an indescribable magic over me. As soon as I get past the first M in the first level with Donkey Kong, I can't stop. I can whistle many of the music pieces from memory today, and I know all the levels by heart. Of course, a lot of nostalgia plays a role. When I say that the game hasn't lost much of its charm, I may be getting ahead of myself a bit, but I still think the first part is the best. While the second part may offer more creative level design, it didn't impress me as much as the first one. The wow factor here was simply much greater, and I am still a very big fan of the game to this day. The success of the jump run catapulted Rare firmly into the developer Olympus. While the British studio was already known for numerous good games before 2001, they had made a strong name for themselves worldwide with Donkey Kong Country, and Nintendo certainly took notice. The Japanese saw the potential and purchased 25% of the studio in 1995, making Rare a second-party developer. Over the years, Nintendo would expand its stake to 49% until they decided in 2002 to sell their shares to Microsoft. But that is a topic for another video. In 1995, another spin-off of the Donkey Kong Country series was released. But before I report on the official second installment, which would see the light of day in December 1995, I would like to talk about Donkey Kong Land first. And yes, strictly speaking, the Donkey Kong Land series does not count as part of the Country series, but the games are so closely intertwined that I can't help but talk about the Land trilogy in this video, especially since they are very similar in gameplay. These are not simply ports of the SNES originals, although Donkey Kong Land was originally intended to be a pure port. In 1994, during the development of the first installment, Tim Stamper approached Paul Makachek, who was responsible for the Game Boy adaptation of their games at Rare. Stamper wanted to see a Game Boy port of the first game, but Paul Makachek suggested creating a completely standalone game, 2001. He referred to the first Battletoads Game Boy game, which was originally intended as a port of the NES original, but was better received by fans and the press as a standalone spin-off. Stamper gave the green light, and Makachek, along with 14 other developers, began working on Donkey Kong Land, which was released worldwide on the Game Boy in the summer of 1995, and, similar to the SNES original, pushed the hardware to its limits. Based on the Battletoads engine, the team managed to utilize advanced computer modeling technology on the Game Boy as well. The SGI models were heavily compressed and fitted onto the Game Boy cartridge, which allowed for graphics that set new standards on the Game Boy in 1995, especially since many moving elements like vines and barrels were implemented to enrich the gameplay. However, it was quite difficult to implement 2001 on the breadbox. Therefore, compromises had to be made elsewhere, such as in the number of characters displayed. Due to hardware limitations, compromises also had to be made with the music. David Weiss adapted some of his tracks from Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy's sound chip, while Graham Norgate contributed music for the completely new levels. Since Donkey Kong Land and Donkey Kong Country were developed in parallel for the most part, and the two teams had little interaction with each other, Donkey Kong Land became a completely standalone game that, while following a similar premise and offering similar gameplay, featured entirely different levels and completely new worlds. The team included a few levels with a pirate setting alongside jungle environments, which we only saw later in the sequel on the Super Nintendo. Additionally, there were brand new worlds such as the Chimpanzee, Clouds, and the Monkey City, each featuring their own levels that were quite challenging. Within the levels, the Kongs also encountered new enemies such as flying pigs, sneaky shellfish, moles, and whirlwinds, which caused a lot of trouble. Along the way, familiar items could be collected, and a new Kong coin provided valuable lives when it was found. Speaking of lives, these were of course very valuable on the Game Boy, and if you didn't save often enough, they could be quickly depleted in the last two worlds. However, saving works differently on the Game Boy. Only those who found all the Kong letters in a level were given the opportunity to save the game at the end. What was still manageable in the first two worlds became very difficult starting from World 3, which could turn the game into a bit of a test of patience. The cause of this was the somewhat clunky controls and the not always accurate collision detection, which made perfect jumps difficult and could lead to plenty of frustration, something I can absolutely confirm. For this video, I played Donkey Kong Land on your Super Game Boy and found myself quite desperate in the fourth and final world. The visuals also received criticism. While Donkey Kong Land was graphically impressive and captured the look and feel of the SNES game very well, the characters often blended so much with the background that it was sometimes very difficult to distinguish enemies and pitfalls, especially on the Game Boy devices. Playing on the Super Game Boy was already easier, as Rare provided official Super Game Boy support, and included a color palette along with a custom frame, which you can also see here. But despite the prevailing criticism, Donkey Kong Land also became a major hit. Although the sales figures did not match those of the original game, Nintendo was able to record a total of 3.91 million units sold, making Donkey Kong Land the best-selling Donkey Kong game on the Game Boy. The American GamePro magazine awarded Donkey Kong's Game Boy appearance the Game Boy Game of the Year 1995, and ratings beyond the 8 and 9 mark confirmed the gameplay quality despite minor flaws. And a little fun fact on the side, the three Donkey Kong Land games were the only Game Boy cartridges that came in yellow, a cool little detail, I think. In May 1995, just under a month before Donkey Kong Land was released in the USA, the first E3 took place, which replaced the Computer Electronics Show known as CES. There, Nintendo revealed the sequel to Donkey Kong Country, which was set to be released by the end of the year. To surprise fans, Rare had planned several changes for the second part, all of which were implemented in just under a year. Thus, Donkey Kong had to be rescued from the clutches of King K. Rool. In this way, sidekick Diddy took on the role of the hero and was supported in his rescue mission by Dixie Kong, a completely new character created by the team for Donkey Kong Country 2. The addition of Diddy's Conquest featured a deliberately crafted wordplay that was meant to showcase Diddy's victorious journey as he teamed up with Dixie to conquer Crocodile Island, which was divided into 8 different worlds with a total of 51 levels. Unlike its predecessor, Donkey Kong Country 2 was significantly more open in its game design and encouraged exploration of the levels. There were numerous secrets, bonus levels, and various items hidden throughout the game, some of which were required to unlock the secret world and complete the game with 101%. But that was not so easy. Rare had responded to criticism from fans who found the first part too easy. So the difficulty level was increased, and some new enemies were added to the game to make life difficult for the two monkeys. With Wanky Kong, a new side character was introduced, where players could answer quiz questions to win bonus items or banana coins. Cranky Kong and Funky Kong also made appearances in the sequel, while Candy Kong was removed and replaced by Wrinkly Kong, Cranky's wife. This now required players to spend coins if they wanted to save their progress more than once per world, which intensified the gameplay, as they had to weigh whether to spend the coins collected in the levels for this purpose. In addition to the familiar Kong letters and the aforementioned banana coins, which were needed for saving, there were also huge decay coins and junk coins hidden. The former were needed for Cranky Kong, and with the latter, players gained access to the secret world, which naturally increased the replay value, as the levels were designed in such a way that not all coins could be found on the first playthrough. To successfully navigate through the various areas, Diddy and Dixie had different abilities at their disposal. Thus, the agile Diddy Kong mastered a strong attack via advice, while Dixie Kong's helicopter jump was excellent for reaching distant platforms or landing more precisely. Additionally, the heroes could carry each other by pressing the A button. By using the Y button, players could throw their partner, allowing them to defeat pesky enemies or reach higher areas, which further enriched the overall gameplay. And of course, the animal companions were also present, with only Rambi and Angard making the transition from the predecessor to the new game. For this, new animals were available, including Squawks the parrot, Radley the rattlesnake, and Squitter the spider, each with their own unique abilities. Additionally, other animals helped the two monkeys situationally, for example, by providing light or cleaning the water, like Sclapper the seal does in this level. As you can see, Diddy's Conquest was packed with extras and gameplay variety, which was also reflected in the level design. While Donkey Kong's island in the first part was somewhat cohesive, Crocodile Island offered many different worlds that could not be thematically different. A pirate ship, the interior of a volcano, or an entire amusement park could also be explored, just like the Lost World or King K. Rool. Roll's Realm truly demanded a challenging level from the players. The same was true for the music. This time, David Wise was solely responsible for the soundtrack of the game and surpassed himself. I dare say that the Donkey Kong Country 2 soundtrack is among the best you can listen to on the Super Nintendo. What David Wise has delivered here is simply incredible. Pieces like Sticker Brush, Symphony Forest Interlude, or Mining Melancholy are timeless and still give me goosebumps even 29 years later. All in all, Rare delivered the perfect sequel with Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest. It was bigger, wilder, and better in every aspect. Of course, the game lacked the striking wow factor in terms of pure graphics, as the same technology was used, but nonetheless it remains one of the best SNES games that can be played on the console to this day. Fans and press representatives felt similarly back in 1995. When the game was released at the end of 1995, retailers had difficulty keeping it in stock. It was practically snatched from their hands, resulting in Donkey Kong Country 2 becoming the second best-selling game of the year, right after Yoshi's Island. And we are talking about the year when both the PlayStation 1 and the Sega Saturn were already available in stores. Although the second part did not reach the legendary 9.31 million units sold by its predecessor, it still made a name for itself with 5.15 million units sold. In 1996, Donkey Kong fans were delighted with two new games. First, Donkey Kong Land 2 was released in November on the Game Boy and was a consistent continuation of the first Land installment. It followed the story and gameplay structure of the great SNES model, but once again offered completely independent levels, even though the level names were taken from Donkey Kong Country 2. Perhaps that was also the reason why Nintendo Power referred to it as a simple adaptation of the SNES game, but that was not the case at all. While it was limited to the elements of the SNES version, the varied level design also invited veterans to replay the game. The only downside was that it did not offer any new elements, such as new enemy types or items, as was the case in the first Donkey Kong Land spin-off. Nevertheless, Donkey Kong Land 2 was also a fantastic platformer that pushed the Game Boy hardware to its limits and did a better job of distinguishing friends from foes against the background, making it easier to play on the original hardware. In terms of gameplay, it was far ahead of its predecessor, as I personally experienced. The lack of collision detection that had cost me nerves in the first Donkey Kong Country game has been completely eliminated here. The jumping mechanics are also significantly better and more direct, which results in the Game Boy version being much easier to control and offering fewer moments of frustration. Of course, the second Game Boy installment also came in the form of a yellow cartridge and was Super Game Boy optimized, which is also my preferred way to play the game. The work on the music was assigned this time to a young employee who had only recently joined Rare just before the development of the game, Grant Kirkhope. He once said in an interview that working on the Donkey Kong Land 2 soundtrack was quite difficult for him, as it was complicated to transfer the music pieces from the SNES original to the Game Boy sound chip. Nevertheless, he did a good job and was set to work on Project Dream after its completion, which would evolve into Banjo-Kazooie, where he also contributed to the soundtrack. 2001. Overall, Donkey Kong sold 2.35 million copies, which once again proved that Rare knew their craft and that the monkeys on the Game Boy had secured a special place in the hearts of fans. A month after the release of Donkey Kong Land 2, the third and final Donkey Kong adventure for the Super Nintendo, Donkey Kong Country, was released. Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. It was Nintendo's last major title for the Super Nintendo, as the Nintendo 64 was already available in Japan and the USA and was about to launch in Europe. In 2001, however, there was still a desire to support the popular Super Nintendo, and Donkey Kong Country 3 was intended to help sell a few more consoles for the Christmas season. The third installment of the series was once again created in just 1 year, as development began immediately after the release of the second part at the end of 1995, even though the development team had split up after completing Diddy's Conquest. A part of the team began work on a game codenamed Project Dream, an action RPG that was planned for the Super Nintendo and would evolve over time. The remaining members of the Donkey Kong Country 2 team began work on the third installment and aimed to surprise fans of the Monkey Gang in many ways once again. The setting was shifted to the northern Kremling Ferry, an environment that, with its forests and lakes, resembles rural areas of Europe and Canada. This is where Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong had set off to. When they did not return, Dixie decided to go in search of the two. Upon arriving in the new game world, she met Funky Kong, who operated a boat rental there. He introduced Dixie to the young Kiddy Kong, who enriched the roster of playable heroes in the third installment, although his design did not receive universal acclaim. In gameplay, Kiddy Kong resembled Donkey Kong. He was heavier, somewhat sluggish, and could thus take out strong enemies. Additionally, Kiddy Kong was able to reveal areas and uncover paths to bonus rooms with the help of the piggyback actions. In 2001, Dixie retained her abilities from the predecessor while exploring the 8 worlds of the Northern Kremling Ferry with Kiddy Kong in tow, completing 48 levels along the way. Other Kong members supported her, including Cranky Kong, Winkly Kong, Funky Kong, and Swanky Kong, as well as the animal companions, with Rambi being replaced by Ellie the elephant, who could spray water from her trunk. In terms of gameplay, not much had changed. Players still jumped through beautiful levels, had to navigate tricky situations, defeat enemies, and battle bosses. And unlike its predecessor, Donkey Kong Country 3 felt a bit more down-to-earth in terms of its setting. There were forests, ice levels, caves, and dangerous barn levels that offered all sorts of obstacles. In direct comparison, the sections of the second installment were somewhat more outlandish and therefore more memorable, while the graphics reached a new level. After playing through the trilogy in the course of the video, I can confirm that Donkey Kong Country 3 is the most beautiful game in the series. The colors are even more vibrant, the levels are more colorful, and the overall graphics are a bit sharper than in its direct predecessor. As for the soundtrack, Evelyn Novakovic was responsible for the majority of the music pieces. Although David Wise contributed a few tracks, overall, Novakovic's work unfortunately did not reach the level of the Donkey Kong Country 2 soundtrack. I don't mean to say that the music is bad. On the contrary, there are just no real pieces that stay in memory for long. But I think it was nearly impossible to follow in the footsteps of David Wise after his masterpiece and to surpass the music of the predecessor. The soundtrack and the already known and perhaps somewhat overused gameplay formula were, by the way, the only 2 points of criticism when the game was released in stores for Christmas '96. The press praised the graphics and awarded the game top ratings despite the criticism. However, the major sales success did not materialize, which in my opinion had nothing to do with the quality of the game. Donkey Kong Country 3 sold 3.51 million copies, making it less successful than its 2 predecessors. However, the timing was also poorly chosen by Nintendo. In September '96, the company had already released the N in the USA, while the console had been available in Japan since June. It was clear that many buyers opted for the next-gen console during the Christmas shopping season and left Donkey Kong Country 3 behind in the process. But yes, after 3 excellent games, the familiar Donkey Kong Country formula may have indeed become a bit worn out. Nevertheless, a third and final game was set to be released at the end of '97 on the Game Boy, at least in Europe and the USA. In October of 1997, Nintendo released Donkey Kong Land, which was once again based on the Super Nintendo game but offered completely independent and thus new levels. It was qualitatively on par with Donkey Kong Land 2. The graphics were once again excellent for Game Boy standards, and the gameplay was close to the SNES original. After 3 Donkey Kong Land games, Rare had mastered the formula and delivered an excellent jump and run that should not be missing from any Game Boy collection. In retrospect, both Donkey Kong Country 3 and Donkey Kong Land 3 are often seen as the black sheep in the fan community, even though I can't really understand the reasons for that. Perhaps it's because we couldn't play as either Donkey or Diddy, or that Kiddy Kong wasn't the best designed Kong character that Rare had created, but in terms of gameplay, Donkey Kong Country 3 has nothing to be criticized for. It is a magnificent jump and run game with many great ideas, challenging levels, and numerous collectibles that significantly increase the replay value compared to its predecessor. Yes, Donkey Kong Country 2 set the bar very high, but I don't think Donkey Kong Country 3 performs worse. When I played it for this video, I actually found the game quite refreshing. I really like the setting, and the graphics are still among the best we have seen on the Super Nintendo. So if you know why the game is considered the black sheep, please enlighten me in the comments. The same goes for Donkey Kong Land 3. With the release of Donkey Kong Country 3 and Donkey Kong Land 3, the official Donkey Kong Country trilogy by Rare came to an end, and it would be 2 years before we would see the Monkey Gang again, at least in video game form. Aside from the console sector, Donkey Kong Country fans could enjoy an animated series starting in 1997, which aired until the year 2000 and consisted of 40 episodes. It was a French-Canadian production that told the adventures of the Kong Gang, and also featured King K. Rool as the antagonist. The series was also broadcast in this country, although only 14 of the total 40 episodes were translated into German. However, when I look at the characters, I am not particularly disappointed. I find the visuals dreadful and therefore have not watched a single episode. I can't say much about it, but I wanted to mention the animated series here. As far as I know, Nintendo and Rare didn't have their hands in it, and if anyone is interested, they can treat themselves to the series on DVD. You can find links to it in the video description. After the completion of Donkey Kong Country 3, the development team began working on the next Donkey Kong game at the beginning of 1997. Originally, the developers wanted to continue the Donkey Kong Country series on the Nintendo 64, which led to the development of a D-platformer that would allow the player to move not only left and right but also up and down within the play area. However, the development of this concept proved to be extremely difficult, also because the team could not continue to use the well-known rendering technique on the Nintendo 64. Although the N was created in collaboration with SGI, as I explained in my extensive Nintendo 64 retrospective, Rare was unable to transfer their advanced computer modeling technology to the new system. The characters and all level environments had to be completely redesigned and created in polygonal graphics. After an 18-month development period, the team therefore abandoned the idea of the D-platformer. At that time, Banjo-Kazooie had been released on the Nintendo 64 and impressively demonstrated how a 3D platformer worked, which is why the Donkey Kong team sought help from the Banjo developers and began the development of a completely three-dimensional Donkey Kong Country game. To distinguish Donkey's adventures from the Donkey Kong Country series and to set them apart from the gameplay mechanics of Banjo-Kazooie, the team decided to discard the buddy mechanic. Ultimately, Benji-Kazooie pushed the two-hero concept to the forefront, and to avoid similarities with the jump-and-run hit, the development team wanted to create several playable characters, with only Donkey and Diddy as established heroes, earning a place in the new character lineup. The remaining characters were all newly designed for the game. Additionally, there was Tim Stamper, who wanted to see more collectible items in the game. He urged the developers to place more items within the levels to keep players engaged for longer and to give the game a more open flow. Individual items such as bananas and coins were placed for each of the 5 playable characters in the levels, which meant that previously played areas had to be searched again up to 5 times. A design decision that was not well received everywhere, but you don't even stop there. The monkeys received new abilities that they could acquire from Cranky Kong, as well as new weapons and instruments that allowed for various new gameplay possibilities. The large number of playable characters, expansive game worlds, and collectible items combined with the very good graphics for the time featuring sharp visuals and great draw distance required new hardware in the form of the expansion pack. At that time, Nintendo argued that the MB memory expansion was used to present the game with a smoother frame rate. However, the statement made by a Rare employee sparked a rumor that persisted for quite some time, claiming that the expansion pack was required to fix a bug that caused the game to crash at a certain point. To avoid this, Nintendo decided to include the expansion pack, which was usually sold separately, with the game at release, according to Chris Marlowe's statement. However, the rumor was debunked by another Rare developer who had actually worked on Donkey Kong 64 in an interview. Mark Stevenson, who worked as an artist on the game, explained that the expansion pack was required to render the real-time lighting and particle effects in the game. Therefore, Nintendo decided to include the memory expansion. Whether this is true or not is really difficult to verify today. The fact is that Donkey Kong 64 was the only game that came with the expansion pack. Games like Zelda Majora's Mask or Perfect Dark also required the expansion pack, but Nintendo chose not to bundle it with these titles. And the fact is that Donkey Kong 64 was one of the most beautiful games on the Nintendo 64 and even offered widescreen support and Dolby surround sound. By the way, this time it was Grant Kirkhope who contributed the music, after he had already received praise for the soundtrack of Donkey Kong Land 2. The music was good as expected, but it lacked a certain recognizability associated with the Donkey Kong Country trilogy. Many sounds were reminiscent of the music pieces from Banjo-Kazooie, for which Kirkhope had also composed the music. The DK rap is probably one of the most well-known songs from the game. It was played in the intro and introduced the playable characters and their abilities. In addition to Donkey and Diddy, this time Tiny, Lanky, and Chunky Kong were also part of the team. In so-called swap barrels, it was possible to switch between characters, which was also crucial if one wanted to fully complete the game and collect all items. At the beginning, only Donkey Kong was available. As King K, Rule's minions were holding the other Kong members captive in the various worlds. Only after freeing Diddy, Tiny, and the others could they be played, and the worlds were truly impressive. There were 8 in total, significantly larger than in Banjo-Kazooie and packed with numerous enemies, as well as side characters who helped during the game, such as Funky, Cranky, or Candy Kong, along with Snide, a new character where players could exchange blueprints for valuable golden bananas. The Ringly Kong, known from Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3, was also present, but she could be found as a ghost in front of the entrances to the respective worlds, providing players with valuable tips and tricks. All these elements ensured that Donkey Kong 64 felt new, yet still had enough connections to the previous titles to keep fans engaged. By the way, that is also the reason why I decided to include the game in this video. Yes, technically speaking, this is not a country installment, but just because the gameplay has been moved into the third dimension and now features large worlds instead of several small levels does not mean that this is a completely different game. In 2001, the story took place after the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, when King K, Rule appeared once again before Donkey Kong's island and swore revenge. Nevertheless, Donkey Kong 64 sometimes felt more like a successor to Banjo-Kazooie, which was further emphasized by the soundtrack. As I played the game for this retrospective, I couldn't help but constantly compare the music to the soundtrack of Banjo-Kazooie. Grant Kirkhope did a great job, no question about it. Nevertheless, I consistently missed the vibe that David Weiss brought to the SNES games. However, the new gameplay direction did not sit well with all fans of Donkey Kong 64. Many enjoyed the search for the countless items and the exploration of the vast worlds, while others felt that the number of collectibles was too high and felt overwhelmed by the game. However, it did not harm its success. Supported by a $22 million marketing campaign, Donkey Kong 64 became an absolute hit when it was available in stores for the Christmas season of '99. The press showered the game with top ratings, reviews, and numerous Game of the Year awards. Overall, Nintendo was able to sell 5.27 million games by the end of the Nintendo 64 era, making Donkey Kong 64 another million seller. Unfortunately, this was Rare's last Donkey Kong game before they were sold by Nintendo to Microsoft in 2002. However, this does not mean that other Donkey Kong Country games were not released in the following years. In 2000, just under 2 months after the release of Donkey Kong 64, the Japan-exclusive Donkey Kong Land 3 was released for the Game Boy Color. In 1997, when Donkey Kong Land 3 was released for the Game Boy, Japan was left out. Just 2.5 years later, the Japanese received what is arguably the best version of the game, featuring an adjusted color palette that made the game even better. Unfortunately, the Game Boy Color version of the game was not released later in the West. However, we were served the next Donkey Kong adventure on the Game Boy Color in November of the year 2000. This time, it was a port of the SNES classic Donkey Kong Country, where I would almost call it a remake. Rare was indeed able to fit the entire game from the Super Nintendo onto the Game Boy Color, including all worlds, enemies, and collectibles. Moreover, the Game Boy Color version even included a new level, making it even more interesting for fans of the original. The game once again pushed the hardware of the Game Boy Color to its limits, as was the case with Rare and Donkey Kong Country. Unfortunately, it was only a port of the SNES original, and the two sequels remained absent from the Game Boy Color. It was an exciting time for Rare and Nintendo. The Brits released Star Fox Adventures in 2002, the first and last game for a Nintendo home console, before being acquired by Microsoft in September 2002 and subsequently developing games for Xbox. However, Microsoft's acquisition did not mean that no Rare games would be released for Nintendo systems anymore. Since Microsoft, the Redmond PC giant, did not have a handheld division, they allowed Rare to continue developing games for Nintendo's portable devices, which led to various titles for the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS. In June 2003, Donkey Kong Country was released for the Game Boy Advance, and what initially seemed like a simple port was, upon closer inspection, a genuine remake developed from the ground up for the Game Boy Advance. The reason for this was the loss of the source codes of the SNES version, which, according to various statements from the developers, were stored on numerous floppy disks and could no longer be found. The development team, which by that time no longer consisted of the same minds that had created the original, took advantage of this circumstance to expand Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Advance in many ways. While the game resembled its 16-bit original in terms of story and gameplay structure, the developers added several new minigames, a new intro and new graphical assets, as well as a distribution of roles among the supporting characters. The island received a redesign, and the overview maps of the respective worlds also got a facelift. You could now save at any time by pressing the start button. In return, you could complete a new dance minigame with Candy Kong, while with Funky Kong, you could continue to use the shuttle service but also play a fishing game. Both minigames were also selectable from the main menu, providing fans with a way to pass the time. Within the levels, there were also hidden cameras that unlocked photos in a new collectible album, providing an additional incentive to replay completed levels if the camera had not been found. Aside from that, Donkey Kong Country was essentially the same game as on the Super Nintendo. Fans and the press celebrated the release and welcomed the small but nice additions. However, the graphics received criticism. It was by no means bad, but it did not match the SNES original, especially since Rare had significantly brightened the visuals to compensate for the lack of lighting on the Game Boy Advance display. However, this was not an isolated case and affected many other GBA games. When playing the game on a regular Game Boy Advance or GBASP, the brightness did not really matter. However, if you are using a modded device with an IPS display or starting the game via Game Boy Player or emulator, it becomes quite noticeable. Nowadays, a restoration mod that can be applied via Homebrew provides a solution. This transfers the color palette and brightness of the SNES original to the Game Boy Advance version, as you can see here. Unfortunately, this restoration mode currently exists only for the first part of the GBA trilogy. Speaking of trilogies, in June 2004, exactly 1 year after the release of Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo released the sequel, which was also developed by Rare as a remake and included the same additions as its predecessor. There was once again a new intro that showed how Donkey Kong was kidnapped by King K. Rool. Minigames were also included, as well as hidden cameras within the levels and the ability to save the game at any time. New were the golden feathers that made it into the game. In each section, one of these golden feathers was hidden, and when collected, there was a surprise waiting at Cranky that players could pick up. Thus, Donkey Kong Country 2 was also a great remake that perfectly captured the charm of the original and enriched it with meaningful details, allowing even those familiar with the original to take a chance on it. And to wrap things up, the third part of the trilogy was on store shelves in November 2005. Once again, it was a remake, but this time it offered significantly more than the two GBA predecessors. Although a new intro that introduced the story was missing, the developers included an entirely new world for the third part, which made it onto the GBA module as a bonus, thus providing real added value compared to the original. The same can be said about the soundtrack. While the first two GBA installments offered a compressed version of the original Super Nintendo soundtracks, David Wise sat down for the third installment and composed a completely new soundtrack that skillfully utilized the GBA sound chip. This completely replaced the music by Evelyn Novakovic, who composed the soundtrack for the original SNES version, giving the GBA installment a distinctly different character. Furthermore, David Wise surpassed himself once again and created 3 melodies for Donkey Kong Country on the GBA that are among the best you can hear on the GBA. Do yourselves a favor and listen to the soundtrack of the GBA game on YouTube. In my opinion, it's already worth catching up on the game on the Game Boy Advance just for that, not to mention the new world and the other bonuses. Like many others, I had long assumed that these were just simple ports of the SNES originals, which is why I avoided the games for a long time. But no, they are true remakes. Aside from Donkey Kong Country 3, a new console installment of the Donkey Kong series was released in 2005, which I would like to mention briefly here, as it neither relates to the series nor was developed by Rare. Donkey Kong Jungle Beat is from Nintendo and was designed as a platformer that utilized the bongo controller, which was developed by Namco for Donkey Konga. Players controlled Donkey Kong by hitting the bongos, which might have sounded strange at first, but in practice it worked quite well and added a burst of innovation to the game. The game really didn't have much in common with the Donkey Kong Country series. There were completely new worlds, new enemies, and new companions that had found their way into the game. Therefore, I would like to hold it to that. Anyone who wants to take a look can play the game on the GameCube or get the Wii version, which was released in 2009 as part of the New Play Control DOS series. After the release of Donkey Kong Country 3 for the GBA, it would take 5 long years before we would see Donkey and Diddy Kong again in a classic jump run. In 2010, there was great joy when Nintendo announced Donkey Kong Country Returns for the Wii, bringing classic gameplay back to a home console. This time, Retro Studios was responsible for the game, having proven their skills with the Metroid Prime trilogy. In December 2010, Donkey Kong Country Returns was released for the Wii and gameplay-wise strongly resembled the Super Nintendo trilogy, even though Retro Studios had implemented some innovations. For instance, the Kremlings were nowhere to be seen. Instead, new enemies, the Tikis, invaded Donkey's Island, hypnotizing animals and stealing the Monkey Gang's banana supply. To retrieve them, Donkey and Diddy set out across the entire island, which consisted of various biomes and offered playful as well as visual variety. The gameplay was fundamentally very similar to the Super Nintendo trilogy. Players jumped through the levels from left to right, defeated enemies, and collected various items. Although Retro Studios only retained the familiar Kong barrels from the predecessors, there were also new banana coins that could be exchanged for lives or other items with Cranky, and there were hidden puzzle pieces in the levels that also needed to be found. Cranky was, by the way, the only Kong character that made it from the predecessors into the new game. All other characters and enemies were newly created by Retro Studios to distinguish Donkey Kong Country Returns from its predecessors. Pigs saved progress at checkpoints, and alongside the familiar Tikis, it was primarily animals and plants that sought to make life difficult for Donkey and Diddy Kong. To defend themselves, the heroes had new abilities at their disposal. For instance, it was no longer possible to switch between Donkey and Diddy Kong at the press of a button. The sidekick sat on Donkey's shoulders, which allowed players to control the heroes simultaneously and make use of Diddy Kong's jetpack, simplifying navigation through the levels. However, when playing with a friend in co-op mode, it was possible to control both characters simultaneously, which was also a novelty, as on the Super Nintendo, players had to high-five each other in multiplayer mode. Since the game was developed for the Wii, motion controls had to be incorporated, of course. By shaking the Wiimote and the nunchuck, Donkey would slam down to break rocks or plants. Additionally, players could blow on booster flowers by moving the Wii Remote, a feature that was integrated into the game at the request of Shigeru Miyamoto to make the gameplay experience even more immersive. Even the well-known roll attack was executed using motion controls, which did not please all fans. Many considered the motion controls to be forced, as they made precise jumps more difficult. Those who wanted to could also play the game with the Wii Remote held sideways, similar to how it was already allowed in New Super Mario Bros. Wii. Through the reorientation, Retro Studios achieved a small stroke of genius. Donkey Kong Country Returns was successfully revived, and the developers managed to maintain the familiar gameplay feel on the Wii. The good graphics and the successful soundtrack, which was created this time by Nintendo composer Kenji Yamamoto, also contributed to this. Yamamoto had already been responsible for the music of the Metroid Prime games, and skillfully remixed the tracks from the predecessors for Donkey Kong Country Returns, while also incorporating a few of his own creations. This resulted in music that sounded familiar while bringing the soundtrack into the modern era with more flair. Unfortunately, David Wise learned about the project too late. In 2009, he parted ways with Rare because he was not satisfied with the direction of the studio under Microsoft. When he then connected with the CEO of Retro Studios, Donkey Kong Country Returns was nearing completion. However, Weiss and Retro Studios agreed that he would return as a composer for a potential sequel. When the game launched in the USA in November 2010 and was released a month later in Europe and Japan, another hit was on the way. It received rave reviews, and financially, Donkey Kong Country Returns became a hit with 6.53 million units sold. Unfortunately, we were denied a sequel on the Wii, and it would take another 3 years before we would see the monkey duo again, this time once more on a handheld. The Nintendo DS received a port of the Wii game in May 2013. This time developed by the Monster Studios, as Retro Studios was heavily occupied with finishing the sequel. Donkey Kong Country Returns was a successful debut for the Kongs on the DS. The feel of the original Wii game was perfectly captured, and the annoying motion controls were cut out. Additionally, there was a new mode for beginners alongside the original gameplay mode, which increased the number of hearts and provided more helpful items, making the game generally a bit easier. Those who were still looking for a challenge could try out a brand new world that offered extremely tough levels in 2001. Of course, the 3D effect was also supported, which gave the game a nice depth and particularly showcased the sections where players had to switch between the foreground and background of a level with the Kongs. All in all, the DS installment was a good port that invited players to replay it due to the new world and impressively demonstrated that the Kongs could continue to shine on Nintendo systems. Even though most DS owners would have preferred a completely new Donkey Kong game, a month after the release of the DS port of Donkey Kong Country Returns, Nintendo announced the sequel for the Wii U during E3 2013. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze was set to be released in February 2014, which of course delighted many fans of the Monkey Gang, myself included. And when the time came, we were presented with a successor that was better in every way. It was the first Donkey Kong Country game developed in HD, which was evident in the outstanding graphics. The levels were even more colorful, and the character models of the playable figures were more detailed, which of course pleased Wii U owners. But it was also significantly better in terms of gameplay. This time, 8 islands had to be explored to drive away the nasty Vikings who were after Donkey Kong's banana treasure. Alongside Diddy, Dixie also made her comeback after her last appearance on the Super Nintendo in 1996. Even Cranky Kong was playable in the latest installment, which increased the number of sidekicks to 3 and brought significantly more variety, as each Kong had their own maneuvers. Diddy continued to use his jetpack while Dixie twirled through the air with her hair, and Cranky Kong used his cane to jump on dangerous thorns or reach higher platforms. The motion controls of the Wii predecessor were also discarded in the Wii U successor. Tropical Freeze was playable with both the Wii U gamepad and the Pro controller, which allowed for significantly higher precision, and this was sorely needed as the game was considerably harder than its Wii counterpart. The blowing mechanic was removed and replaced with a new ability. This time, Donkey could pull things up from the ground, which, while not significantly enriching the gameplay, was still better implemented than the blowing in its predecessor. A dynamic camera was also introduced to highlight the size of the levels. However, it was nothing more than a nice gimmick that had no impact on the gameplay. David Weiss returned as the composer and once again created a soundtrack that enriched the game and provided musical pieces that proved once more that Weiss was a master of his craft. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze was, just like Diddy's Conquest back in the Super Nintendo days, the perfect sequel. It was superior to the Wii version in every aspect, which did not go unnoticed by fans and the press. Unfortunately, the major commercial success did not materialize, which was certainly related to the weak sales figures of the Wii U. Only 2.02 million copies were sold, which was a shame and certainly prompted Nintendo to re-release Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze in 2018, this time on the Nintendo Switch. However, the switchboard brought little noise, with only a new mode for beginner players being added. Here, Funky Kong was available as a playable character, which also increased the energy and made the game significantly easier overall, as Funky could stand on spikes and swirl through the air with his surfboard. However, new items or a new world, as was the case on the DS, were sought in vain on the Switch, which brought some criticism to Nintendo and the Retro Studios, as Tropical Freeze was sold at full price on the Switch. After all, with 4.62 million units sold, more than twice as many games were sold compared to the Wii U. However, measured by the number of available Switch consoles, it was not particularly much, as the Wii version sold significantly better. Perhaps that is also the reason why we have been waiting for a brand new game since 2014. But let's briefly talk about the Wii version again. In 2019 it was ported once more, this time to the Nvidia Shield and only in China. What makes the port special are the revamped controls and graphics. The Nvidia Shield version came with traditional controller support and featured crisp HD graphics. It would be easy for Nintendo to release the Shield version on the Switch, and I still wonder what is holding them back. But hey, maybe we'll see the Donkey Kong Country series again this year. After all, the Monkey Gang is celebrating an anniversary. While you can play the SNES trilogy on the Switch as part of the online membership, I would welcome a completely new installment even more. Preferably as a remake of the Super Nintendo original to celebrate the round anniversary, or as a sequel to Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze from Retro Studios to complete the trilogy. I mean, I would even be satisfied with a re-release of the Nvidia Shield ports. The main thing is that we get a new Donkey Kong Country game. Everything that Nintendo has given us this year was the remake of Mario vs. Donkey Kong, which is certainly quite nice. But I want more than just being a Donkey Kong fan, But what do you think? Feel free to share your memories and experiences with the Donkey Kong series in the comments. I believe many of you have fond memories of the Super Nintendo trilogy. But what about the Land trilogy? What do you think of Donkey Kong 64? Have you played the 2 Game Boy games? And what do you think of the work of Retro Studios? I look forward to your comments and hereby conclude my review of this series. It was incredibly fun to play through all the games, simply because they haven't lost any of their playability over the years. I hope you had a little fun watching. If you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate a like and a subscription if you haven't done so already. You know how it is. Thank you for watching, and see you next time for another retrospective here on Game Worlds. Adios, your Andy.